El Salvador was for centuries inhabited by several Mesoamerican nations, especially the Cuscatlucs, as well as the Lenca and Maya. In the early 16th century, the Spanish Empire conquered the territory, incorporating it into the Viceroyalty of New Spain ruled from Mexico City. However, the Viceroyalty of Mexico had little or no influence in the daily affairs of the Central American Isthmus, which would be colonized in 1524. In 1609 the area became the Captaincy General of Guatemala, from which El Salvador was part of until its independence from Spain, which took place in 1821, as part of the First Mexican Empire, then further seceded, as part of the Federal Republic of Central America, in 1823. When the Republic dissolved in 1841, El Salvador became a sovereign nation, then formed a short-lived union with Honduras and Nicaragua called the Greater Republic of Central America, which lasted from 1895 to 1898. From the late 19th to the mid-20th century, El Salvador endured chronic political and economic instability characterized by coups, revolts, and a succession of authoritarian rulers. Persistent socio-economic inequality and civil unrest culminated in the devastating Salvadoran Civil War 1979 to 1992, which was fought between the military-led government and a coalition of left-wing guerrilla groups. The conflict ended with the Chapultepec Peace Accords. This negotiated settlement established a multi-party constitutional republic, which remains in place to this day. El Salvador's economy has historically been dominated by agriculture, beginning with the indigo plantanal in Spanish, the most important crop during the colonial period, and followed thereafter by coffee, which by the early 20th century accounted for 90% of export earnings. El Salvador has since reduced its dependence on coffee and embarked on diversifying the economy by opening up trade and financial links and expanding the manufacturing sector. The colon, the official currency of El Salvador since 1892, was replaced by the U.S. dollar in 2001. El Salvador ranks 16th among Latin American countries in terms of the Human Development Index and 4th in Central America behind Panama, Costa Rica, and Belize due in part to ongoing rapid industrialization. However, the country continues to struggle with high rates of poverty, inequality, and crime.
Etymology.
Conquistador Pedro de Alvarado named the new province for Jesus Christ, El Salvador the Savior. The full name was Province of Our Lord Jesus Christ, the Savior of the World, which was subsequently abbreviated to the Savior.
History. Prehistoric.
Tomai 8 is a paleontological site located on the banks of the river of the same name in the municipality of Apogba. The site has produced abundant Salvadoran megafauna fossils belonging to the Pleistocene epoch. The paleontological site was discovered accidentally in 2000, and in the following year, an excavation by the Museum of Natural History of El Salvador revealed not only several remnants of Cuvironeus, but also several other species of vertebrates. In the Tomai 8 site, they have recovered at least 19 species of vertebrates, including giant tortoises, Megatherium, Glyptodon, Toxodon, extinct horses, paleolamas and especially a large number of skeletal remains of proboscis genus Cuvironeus. The Tomai 8 site stands out from most Central American Pleistocene deposits, being more ancient and much richer, which provides valuable information of the Great American Interchange, in which the Central American Isthmus Land Bridge played the vital primordial role. At the same time, it is considered the richest vertebrate paleontological site in Central America and one of the largest accumulations of proboscideans in the Americas.
Pre-Columbian.
Sophisticated civilization in El Salvador dates to its settlement by the indigenous Lenca people. Theirs was the first and the oldest indigenous civilization to settle in El Salvador. The Lenca were succeeded by the Olmecs, who eventually also disappeared, leaving their monumental architecture in the form of the pyramids still extant in western El Salvador. The Maya arrived and settled in place of the Olmecs, but their numbers were greatly diminished when the Ilopango supervolcano eruption caused a massive Mayan exodus out of what is now El Salvador. who migrated from Mexico in the centuries before the European conquest and occupied the central and western regions. The Pipil were the last indigenous people to arrive in El Salvador. They called their territory Cuscatlan, a Pipil word meaning the place of precious jewels, back-formed into classical Nahuatl Cuscatlan, and Hispanicized as Cuscatlan. The people of El Salvador today are referred to as Salvadoran, while the term Cuscatlco is commonly used to identify someone of Salvadoran heritage. In pre-Columbian times, the country was also inhabited by various other indigenous peoples, including the Lenca, a Chilanga-Lencan-speaking group who settled in the eastern highlands. Cuscatlan was the larger domain until the Spanish conquest. Since El Salvador resided on the eastern edge of the Maya civilization, the origins of many of El Salvador's ruins are controversial. However, it is widely agreed that Mayas likely occupied the areas around Lago de Guio and Sayutan. Other ruins such as Tazumal, Joya de Siran and San Andres may have been built by the Pipil or the Maya or possibly both.
European contact 1522.
By 1521, the indigenous population of the Mesoamerican area had been drastically reduced by the smallpox epidemic that was spreading throughout the territory, although it had not yet reached pandemic levels in Cuscatlan. The first known visit by Spaniards to what is now Salvadoran territory was made by the Spanish Admiral Andres Nino, who led a Spanish expedition to Central America. He disembarked in the Gulf of Fonseca on May 31, 1522, at Mingaro Island, naming it Petronla, and then discovered Jicalisco Bay on the mouth of Lempa River. The first indigenous people to have contact with the Spanish were the Lenca of eastern El Salvador.
Conquest of Cuscatlan 1524 to 1525.
In 1524, after participating in the conquest of Mexico, Spanish conquistadors led by Pedro de Alvarado and his brother Gonzalo crossed the Rio Paz Peace River from the area comprising the present Republic of Guatemala into what is now the Republic of El Salvador. The Spaniards were disappointed to discover that the indigenous Pipil people had no gold or jewels like those they had found in Guatemala or Mexico, but recognized the richness of the land's volcanic soil. Pedro de Alvarado led the first incursion by Spanish forces to extend their dominion to the nation of Cuscatlan El Salvador, in June 1524. When he arrived at the borders of the Cuscatlan kingdom he saw that civilians had been evacuated. Cuscatlec warriors moved to the coastal city of Acajiatla and waited for Alvarado and his forces. Alvarado approached, confident that the result would be similar to what occurred in Mexico and Guatemala where the people believed the Spanish were gods. He thought he would easily defeat this new indigenous force since his Mexican allies and the Pipil of Cuscatlan spoke a similar language. The indigenous peoples of El Salvador did not see the Spanish as gods, but as foreign invaders. Alvarado saw that the Cuscatlan force outnumbered his Spanish soldiers and Mexican Indian allies. The Spanish withdrew and the Cuscatlec army attacked, running behind them with war chants and shooting bow arrows. Alvarado had no choice but to fight to survive. Alvarado described the Cuscatlec soldiers in great detail as having shields made of colorful exotic feathers, a vest-like armor made of 3-inch cotton which arrows could not penetrate, and large spears. Both armies suffered many casualties, with a wounded Alvarado retreating and losing a lot of his men, especially among the Mexican Indian auxiliaries. Once his army had regrouped, Alvarado decided to head to the Cuscatlan capital and again faced armed Cuscatlec. Wounded, unable to fight and hiding in the cliffs, Alvarado sent his Spanish men on their horses to approach the Cuscatlec to see if they would fear the horses, but they did not retreat. Alvarado recalls in his letters to Hernan Cortés, the Cuscatlec attacked again, and on this occasion stole Spanish weaponry. Alvarado retreated and sent Mexican Indian messengers to demand that the Cuscatlec warriors return the stolen weapons and surrender to the Spanish king. The Cuscatlec responded with the famous response, "If you want your weapons, come get them." As days passed, Alvarado, fearing an ambush, sent more Mexican Indian messengers to negotiate, but these messengers never came back and were presumably executed. The Spanish efforts were firmly resisted by the indigenous people, including the Pipil and their Mayan-speaking neighbors. They defeated the Spaniards and what was left of their Mexican Tlaxcala Indian allies, forcing them to withdraw to Guatemala. After being wounded, Alvarado abandoned the war and appointed his brother, Gonzalo de Alvarado, to continue the task. Two subsequent expeditions, the first in 1525, followed by a smaller group in 1528, brought the Pipil under Spanish control, since the Pipil also were weakened by a regional epidemic of smallpox. In 1525, the conquest of Cuzcatlan was completed and the city of San Salvador was established. The Spanish faced much resistance from the Pipil and were not able to reach eastern El Salvador, the area of the Lencas. In 1526 the Spanish founded the garrison town of San Miguel, headed by another explorer and conquistador, Luis de Moscoso Alvarado, nephew of Pedro Alvarado. Oral history holds that a Maya Lenca crown princess, Antusilana organized resistance to the conquistadors. The kingdom of Lenca was alarmed by de Moscoso's invasion, and Antusilan traveled from village to village, uniting all the Lenca towns in present-day El Salvador and Honduras against the Spaniards. Through surprise attacks and overwhelming numbers, they were able to drive the Spanish out of San Miguel and destroy the garrison. For 10 years the Lencas prevented the Spanish from building a permanent settlement. Then the Spanish returned with more soldiers, including about 2,000 forced conscripts from indigenous communities in Guatemala. They pursued the Lenca leaders further up into the mountains of Intibucá. Antusilan eventually handed over control of the Lenca resistance to Lempira, also called Impera. Lempira was noteworthy among indigenous leaders in that he mocked the Spanish by wearing their clothes after capturing them and using their weapons captured in battle. Lempira fought in command of thousands of Lenca forces for 6 more years in El Salvador and Honduras until he was killed in battle. The remaining Lenca forces retreated into the hills. The Spanish were then able to rebuild their garrison town of San Miguel in 1537.
Spanish rule 1525 to 1821.
During the colonial period, El Salvador was part of the Captaincy General of Guatemala, also known as the Kingdom of Guatemala, created in 1609 as an administrative division of New Spain. The Salvadoran territory was administered by the mayor of Sonsonate, with San Salvador being established as an intendencia in 1786. Towards the end of 1811, a combination of internal and external factors motivated Central American elites to attempt to gain independence from the Spanish crown. The most important internal factors were the desire of local elites to control the country's affairs free of involvement from Spanish authorities, and the long-standing Creole aspiration for independence. The main external factors motivating the independence movement were the success of the French and American revolutions in the 18th century, and the weakening of the Spanish crown's military power as a result of the Napoleonic Wars, with the resulting inability to control its colonies effectively. In November 1811, Salvadoran priest José Macias Delgado rang the bells of Iglesia La immersed in San Salvador, calling for insurrection and launching the 1811 independence movement. This insurrection was suppressed and many of its leaders were arrested and served sentences in jail. Another insurrection was launched in 1814, and again this insurrection was also suppressed.
Independence 1821.
In 1821, in light of unrest in Guatemala, Spanish authorities capitulated and signed the Act of Independence of Central America, which released all of the captaincy of Guatemala comprising current territories of Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua and Costa Rica and the Mexican state of Chiapas from Spanish rule and declared its independence. In 1821, El Salvador joined Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras and Nicaragua in a union named the Federal Republic of Central America. In early 1822, the authorities of the newly independent Central American provinces, meeting in Guatemala City, voted to join the newly constituted First Mexican Empire under Agustín de Iturbide. El Salvador resisted, insisting on autonomy for the Central American countries. A Mexican military detachment marched to San Salvador and suppressed dissent, but with the fall of Iturbide on the 19th of March 1823, the army decamped back to Mexico. Shortly thereafter, the authorities of the provinces revoked the vote to join Mexico, deciding instead to form a federal union of the 5 remaining provinces. Chiapas permanently joined Mexico at this juncture. When the Federal Republic of Central America dissolved in 1841, El Salvador maintained its own government until it joined Honduras and Nicaragua in 1896 to form the Greater Republic of Central America, which dissolved in 1898. After the mid-19th century, the economy was based on coffee growing. As the world market for indigo withered away, the economy prospered or suffered as the world coffee price fluctuated. The enormous profits that coffee yielded as a monoculture export served as an impetus for the concentration of land into the hands of an oligarchy of just a few families. Throughout the last half of the 19th century, a succession of presidents from the ranks of the Salvadoran oligarchy, nominally both conservative and liberal, generally agreed on the promotion of coffee as the predominant cash crop, the development of infrastructure, railroads and port facilities primarily in support of the coffee trade, the elimination of communal land holdings to facilitate further coffee production, the passage of anti-vagrancy laws to ensure that displaced campesinos and other rural residents provided sufficient labor for the coffee fincas' plantations, and the suppression of rural discontent. In 1912, the National Guard was created as a rural police force.
20th century.
In 1898, Gen. Thomas Regalado gained power by force, deposing Rafael Antonio Gutierrez and ruling as president until 1903. Once in office, he revived the practice of presidents designating their successors. After serving his term, he remained active in the Army of El Salvador, and was killed July 11, 1906, at El Jicaro during a war against Guatemala. Until 1913, El Salvador was politically stable, with undercurrents of popular discontent. When President Dr. Manuel Enrique Arroyo was killed in 1913, many hypotheses were advanced for the political motive of his murder. Arroyo's administration was followed by the Melendez-Quinones dynasty that lasted from 1913 to 1927. Pio Romero Bosque, ex-minister of the government and a trusted collaborator of the dynasty, succeeded President Jorge Melendez and in 1930 announced free elections, in which Arturo Arroyo came to power on March 1, 1931 in what was considered the country's first freely contested election. His government lasted only 9 months before it was overthrown by junior military officers who accused his Labour Party of lacking political and governmental experience and of using its government offices inefficiently. President Arroyo faced general popular discontent, as the people had expected economic reforms and the redistribution of land. There were demonstrations in front of the National Palace from the first week of his administration. His vice president and minister of war was Gen. Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez. In December 1931, a coup d'état organized by junior officers and led by Gen. Martinez started in the 1st Regiment of Infantry across from the National Palace in downtown San Salvador. Only the 1st Regiment of Cavalry and the National Police defended the presidency. The National Police had been on its payroll, but later that night, after hours of fighting, the badly outnumbered defenders surrendered to rebel forces. The Directorate, composed of officers, hid behind a shadowy figure, a rich anti-communist banker called Rodolfo Duque, and later installed the ardent fascist Gen. Martinez as president. The revolt was probably due to the army's discontent at not having been paid by President Arroyo for some months. Arroyo left the National Palace and unsuccessfully tried to organize forces to defeat the revolt. The U.S. minister in El Salvador met with the Directorate and later recognized the government of Martinez, which agreed to hold presidential elections. He resigned 6 months prior to running for re-election, winning back the presidency as the only candidate on the ballot. He ruled from 1935 to 1939, then from 1939 to 1943. He began a 4th term in 1944, but resigned in May after a general strike. Martinez had said he was going to respect the Constitution, which stipulated he could not be re-elected, but he refused to keep his promise. From December 1931, the year of the coup that brought Martinez to power, there was brutal suppression of rural resistance. The most notable event was the February 1932 Salvadoran peasant uprising, originally led by Farabundo Martí and Abel Cuenca, and university students Alfonso Luna and Mario Zapata, but these leaders were captured before the planned insurrection. Only Cuenca survived. The other insurgents were killed by the government. After the capture of the movement leaders, the insurrection erupted in a disorganized and mob-controlled fashion, resulting in government repression that was later referred to as La Matanza, the massacre, because tens of thousands of peasants died in the ensuing chaos on the orders of President Martinez. In the unstable political climate of the previous few years, the social activist and revolutionary leader Farabundo Martí helped found the Communist Party of Central America, and led a communist alternative to the Red Cross called International Red Aid, serving as one of its representatives. Their goal was to help poor and underprivileged Salvadorans through the use of Marxist-Leninist ideology, strongly rejecting Stalinism. In December 1930, at the height of the country's economic and social depression, Martí was once again exiled due to his popularity among the nation's poor and rumors of his upcoming nomination for president the following year. Once Arturo Aro was elected president in 1931, Martí returned to El Salvador, and along with Alfonso Luna and Mario Zapata began the movement that was later truncated by the military. They helped start a guerrilla revolt of indigenous farmers. The government responded by killing over 30,000 people at what was to have been a peaceful meeting in 1932. This became known as La Matanza, the slaughter. The peasant uprising against Martinez was crushed by the Salvadoran military 10 days after it had begun. The communist-led rebellion, fermented by collapsing coffee prices, enjoyed some initial success, but was soon drowned in a bloodbath. President Martinez, who had himself toppled an elected government only weeks earlier, ordered the defeated Martí shot after a perfunctory hearing. Historically, the high Salvadoran population density has contributed to tensions with neighboring Honduras, as land-poor Salvadorans emigrated to less densely populated Honduras and established themselves as squatters on unused or underused land. This phenomenon was a major cause of the 1969 football war between the two countries. As many as 130,000 Salvadorans were forcibly expelled or fled from Honduras. The Christian Democratic Party (PDC) and the National Conciliation Party (PCN) were active in Salvadoran politics from 1960 until 2011, when they were disbanded by the Supreme Court because they had failed to win enough votes in the 2004 presidential election. Both parties have since reconstituted. They share common ideals, but one represents the middle class and the latter the interests of the Salvadoran military. PDC leader José Napoleón Darty was the mayor of San Salvador from 1964 to 1970. Winning 3 elections during the regime of PCN President Julio Adalberto Rivera Carballo, who allowed free elections for mayors and the National Assembly. Darty later ran for president with a political grouping called the National Opposition Union UNO, but was defeated in the 1972 presidential elections. He lost to the ex-Minister of Interior, Col. Arturo Armando Molina, in an election that was widely viewed as fraudulent. Molina was declared the winner even though Darty was said to have received a majority of the votes. Darty, at some army officer's request, supported a revolt to protest the election fraud, but was captured, tortured and later exiled. Darty returned to the country in 1979 to enter politics after working on projects in Venezuela as an engineer.
Salvadoran Civil War 1979 to 1992.
In October 1979, a coup d'état brought the revolutionary government junta of El Salvador to power. It nationalized many private companies and took over much privately owned land. The purpose of this new junta was to stop the revolutionary movement already underway in response to Darty's stolen election. Nevertheless, the oligarchy opposed agrarian reform, and a junta formed with young liberal elements from the army such as Gen. Majano and Gen. Gutierrez, as well as with progressives such as Guillermo Ungo and Alvarez. Pressure from the oligarchy soon dissolved the junta because of its inability to control the army in its repression of the people fighting for unionization rights, agrarian reform, better wages, accessible health care and freedom of expression. In the meantime, the guerrilla movement was spreading to all sectors of Salvadoran society. Middle and high school students were organized in MERS Movimiento Estudiantil Revolucionario de Secundaria, revolutionary movement of secondary students. College students were involved with AJUS Asociación de Estudiantes Universitarios Salvadoreños, Association of Salvadoran College Students, and workers were organized in BPR Bloc Popular Revolucionario, Popular Revolutionary Bloc. In October 1980, several other major guerrilla groups of the Salvadoran left had formed the Farabundo Marti National Liberation Front, or FMLN. By the end of the 1970s, death squads were killing about 10 people each day, and the FMLN had 6,000 to 8,000 active guerrillas and hundreds of thousands of part-time militia, supporters, and sympathizers. The U.S. supported and financed the creation of a second junta to change the political environment and stop the spread of a leftist insurrection. Napoleon Dati was recalled from his exile in Venezuela to head this new junta. However, a revolution was already underway and his new role as head of the junta was seen by the general population as opportunistic. He was unable to influence the outcome of the insurrection. Oscar Romero, Archbishop of San Salvador, denounced injustices and massacres committed against civilians by government forces. He was considered the voice of the voiceless, but he was assassinated by a death squad while saying Mass on the 24th of March 1980. Some consider this to be the beginning of the full Salvadoran Civil War, which lasted from 1980 to 1992. An unknown number of people disappeared during the conflict, and the UN reports that more than 75,000 were killed. The Salvadoran Army's US-trained Atlacatl Battalion was responsible for the El Mozote massacre where more than 800 civilians were murdered, over half of them children, the El Calabozo massacre, and the murder of Yucca scholars. On January 16, 1992, the government of El Salvador, represented by President Alfredo Cristiani, and the FMLN, represented by the commanders of the 5 guerrilla groups, Shafik Handel, Joaquin Villalobos, Salvador Sanchez Ceran, Francisco Jovel and Eduardo Sancho, all signed peace agreements brokered by the United Nations ending the 12-year civil war. This event, held at Chapultepec Castle in Mexico, was attended by UN dignitaries and other representatives of the international community. After signing the armistice, the president stood up and shook hands with all the now ex-guerrilla commanders, an action which was widely admired.
Post-war 1992 present.
The so-called Chapultepec peace accords mandated reductions in the size of the army, and the dissolution of the National Police, the Treasury Police, the National Guard and the Civilian Defense, a paramilitary group. A new civil police was to be organized. Judicial immunity for crimes committed by the armed forces ended. The government agreed to submit to the recommendations of a Commission on the Truth for El Salvador Commission de la Verdad para El Salvador, which would investigate serious acts of violence occurring since 1980, and the nature and effects of the violence, and recommend methods of promoting national reconciliation. In 1993 the Commission delivered its findings reporting human rights violations on both sides of the conflict. 5 days later the El Salvadoran legislature passed an amnesty law for all acts of violence during the period. From 1989 until 2004, Salvadorans favored the Nationalist Republican Alliance Arena Party, voting in Arena presidents in every election Alfredo Cristiani, Armando Calderon Sol, Francisco Flores Perez, Antonio Saca until 2009, when Mauricio Funes was elected president from the Farabundo Marti National Liberation Front FMLN party. Economic reforms since the early 1990s brought major benefits in terms of improved social conditions, diversification of the export sector, and access to international financial markets at investment grade level. Crime remains a major problem for the investment climate. This all ended in 2001, and support for Arena weakened. Internal turmoil in Arena weakened the party also, while the FMLN united and broadened its support. The unsuccessful attempts of the left-wing party to win presidential elections led to its selection of a journalist rather than a former guerrilla leader as a candidate. On March 15, 2009, Mauricio Funes, a television figure, became the first president from the FMLN party. He was inaugurated on June 1, 2009. One focus of the Funes government has been revealing the alleged corruption from the past government. Arena formally expelled Saka from the party in December 2009. With 12 loyalists in the National Assembly, Saka established his own party, Ghana Gran Allianza pour l'Unidad Nationale or Grand Alliance for National Unity, and entered into a tactical legislative alliance with the FMLN. After 3 years in office, with Saka Ghana Party providing the FMLN with a legislative majority, Funes had not taken action to either investigate or to bring corrupt former officials to justice. Early in the new millennium, El Salvador's government created the Ministerio de Medio Ambiente y Recursos Naturales, the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources MAN, and began promoting the integration of climate change into national policy. This move was in response to the increase in extreme weather events affecting the country. Initially MAN aimed to fulfill the country's obligations following its ratification of the UNFC and the Kyoto Protocol. However, since Hurricane Ida in 2009, the government's stance has shifted towards integrating risk reduction into all areas of policy, including financial, in a specific effort to increase the resilience of its economy and people to climate-related events. El Salvador commissioned a project in 2011 to develop and implement a national policy and strategy for climate change, which culminated with the launch of the National Environmental Policy in June 2012 and the National Environmental Strategy in June 2013, both incorporating climate change goals. This work was undertaken with support from the Climate and Development Knowledge Network. The government is now preparing action plans for putting the strategy into practice. In the summer of 2001, a severe drought destroyed 80% of El Salvador's crops, causing famine in the countryside. On October 4, 2005, severe rains resulted in dangerous flooding and landslides, which caused a minimum of 50 deaths. El Salvador's location in Central America also makes it vulnerable to severe storms and hurricanes coming off the Caribbean. Since the 1990s, there has been an increase in the frequency and duration of storms, as well as a marked change in the pattern of their occurrence. Hurricanes used to strike El Salvador infrequently, only came from the Atlantic and were limited to the months of September and October. However, since the mid-1990s, such storms have occurred more frequently, originated in both the Atlantic and Pacific, and have struck in 6 different months of the year. And another earthquake only a month later, on February 13, 2001. That killed 255 people and damaged about 20% of the nation's housing. Luckily, many families were able to find safety from the landslides caused by the earthquake. The San Salvador area has been hit by earthquakes in 1576, 1659, 1798, 1839, 1854, 1873, 1880, 1917, 1919, 1965, 1986, 2001 and 2005. The 5.7 MW earthquake of 1986 resulted in 1,500 deaths, 10,000 injuries, and 100,000 people left homeless. El Salvador's most recent destructive volcanic eruption took place on October 1, 2005, when the Santa Ana volcano spewed a cloud of ash, hot mud and rocks that fell on nearby villages and caused 2 deaths. The most severe volcanic eruption in this area occurred in the 5th century AD when the Ilopango volcano erupted with a strength of 6, producing widespread pyroclastic flows and devastating Mayan cities. The Santa Ana volcano in El Salvador is active. The most recent eruptions were in 1904 and 2005. Lago de Coatepec, one of El Salvador's lakes, was created by water filling the caldera that formed after a massive eruption. The British Imperial College's El Salvador project aims to build earthquake-proof buildings in remote areas of the country.
Biodiversity and endangered species.
There are 8 species of sea turtles in the world. 6 of them nest on the coasts of Central America, and 4 make their home on the Salvadoran coast. The leatherback turtle Dermoclis coriacea, the hawksbill Dermoclis imbricata, the green sea turtle Black Chelonia agassizii and the olive ridley Lepidoclis olivacea. Of these 4 species, the most common is the olive ridley turtle, followed by the green sea turtle. The other 2 species, hawksbill and leatherback, are much more difficult to find as they are critically endangered, while the olive ridley and green sea turtle are in danger of extinction. Recent conservation efforts provide hope for the future of the country's biological diversity. In 1997, the government established the Ministry of the Environment and Natural Resources. A general environmental framework law was approved by the National Assembly in 1999. Specific legislation to protect wildlife is still pending. In addition, a number of non-governmental organizations are doing important work to safeguard some of the country's most important forested areas. Foremost among these is Salvanatura, which manages El Impossible, the country's largest national park under an agreement with El Salvador's environmental authorities. Despite these efforts, much remains to be done. It is estimated that there are 500 species of birds, 1,000 species of butterflies, 400 species of orchids, 800 species of trees, and 800 species of marine fish in El Salvador.
Government and politics.
The 1983 Constitution is the highest legal authority in the country. El Salvador has a democratic and representative government, whose 3 bodies are: the executive branch, headed by the President of the Republic, who is elected by direct vote and remains in office for 5 years. He can be elected to only 1 term. The President has a cabinet of ministers whom he appoints, and is also the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. The legislative branch, called El Salvador's Legislative Assembly unicameral, consisting of 84 deputies. The judiciary, headed by the Supreme Court, which is composed of 15 judges, one of them being elected as president of the judiciary. After the Civil War, the Chapultepec Peace Accords 1992 created the new National Civil Police, the Attorney for the Defense of Human Rights and the Supreme Electoral Tribunal. The peace accords reimagined the Frente Farabundo para la Liberación Nacional (FMLN) as a political party and redefined the role of the army to be for the defense of the sovereignty and territorial integrity. The accords also removed some security forces who were in command of the army, such as the National Guard, Treasury Police and special battalions that were formed to fight against the insurgency of the 1980s. The political framework of El Salvador is a presidential representative democratic republic with a multiform, multi-party system. The president, currently Salvador Sanchez Cerón, is both head of state and head of government. Executive power is exercised by the government. Legislative power is vested in both the government and the Legislative Assembly. The country also has an independent judiciary and Supreme Court.
Political culture.
El Salvador has a multi-party system. 2 political parties, the Nationalist Republican Alliance ARENA and the Farabundo National Liberation Front FMLN have tended to dominate elections. ARENA candidates won 4 consecutive presidential elections until the election of Mauricio Funes of the FMLN in March 2009. The FMLN party is leftist in ideology, and is split between the dominant Marxist-Leninist faction in the legislature, and the social liberal wing led by President Funes. Geographically, the departments of the central region, especially the capital and the coastal regions, known as Departamentos Rojos, or red departments, are relatively leftist. The Departamentos Azules, or blue departments in the east, western and highland regions are relatively conservative. The winner of the 2014 presidential election, Salvador Sanchez Cerón, belongs to the FMLN party. In the 2015 elections for mayors and members of the National Assembly, ARENA appeared to be the winner with tight control of the National Assembly.
Foreign relations.
In November, 1950 El Salvador helped the newly empowered 14th Dalai Lama by supporting his Tibetan government cabinet minister's telegram requesting an appeal before the General Assembly of the United Nations to stop the Communist China's People's Liberation Army's invasion of Tibet. Only the tiny country of El Salvador agreed to sponsor Tibet's plea. At the UN, no one was willing to stand up beside El Salvador. The other nations had overriding self-interests, which made it impossible for them to support San Salvador's attempt to bring the invasion before the General Assembly. In 2017, El Salvador signed the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons.
Human rights.
Amnesty International has drawn attention to several arrests of police officers for unlawful police killings. Other current issues to gain Amnesty International's attention in the past 10 years include missing children, failure of law enforcement to properly investigate and prosecute crimes against women, and rendering organized labor illegal. Discrimination against LGBT people in El Salvador is very widespread. According to 2013 survey by the Pew Research Center, 62% of Salvadorans believe that homosexuality should not be accepted by society.
Administrative divisions.
El Salvador is divided into 14 departments, departamentos, which in turn are subdivided into 262 municipalities, municipios. Department names and capitals for the 14 Salvadoran departments.
Economy.
El Salvador's economy has been hampered at times by natural disasters such as earthquakes and hurricanes, by government policies that mandate large economic subsidies, and by official corruption. Subsidies became such a problem that in April 2012, the International Monetary Fund suspended a $750 million loan to the central government. President Funes' chief of cabinet, Alex Segovia, acknowledged that the economy was at the point of collapse. Antigua-Cuscatlan has the highest per capita income of all the cities in the country, and is a center of international investment. GDP in purchasing power parity (PPP) in 2008 was estimated at $25 $895 billion. The service sector is the largest component of GDP at 64.1%, followed by the industrial sector at 24.7%. 2008. Agriculture represents only 11.2% of GDP. 2010. The GDP grew after 1996 at an annual rate that averaged 3.2% real growth. The government committed to free market initiatives, and the 2007 GDP's real growth rate was 4.7%. In December 1999, net international reserves equaled $1.8 billion, or roughly 5 months of imports. Having this hard currency buffer to work with, the Salvadoran government undertook a monetary integration plan beginning January 1, 2001, by which the U.S. dollar became legal tender alongside the Salvadoran colon, and all formal accounting was done in U.S. dollars. Thus, the government has formally limited the implementing of open market monetary policies to influence short-term variables in the economy. As of September 2007, net international reserves stood at $2.42 billion. It has long been a challenge in El Salvador to develop new growth sectors for a more diversified economy. In the past, the country produced gold and silver, but recent attempts to reopen the mining sector, which were expected to add hundreds of millions of dollars to the local economy, collapsed after President Sarko shut down the operations of Pacific Rim Mining Corporation. Nevertheless, according to the Central American Institute for Fiscal Studies Instituto Centroamericano for Estudios Fiscales, by its acronym in Spanish, the contribution of metallic mining was a minuscule 0.3% of the country's GDP between 2010 and 2015. Sarko decision, although not lacking political motives, had strong support from local residents and grassroots movements in the country. According to NACLA, incoming President Funes later rejected a company's application for a further permit based on the risk of cyanide contamination on one of the country's main rivers. As with other former colonies, El Salvador was considered a mono-export economy, an economy that depended heavily on one type of export for many years. During colonial times, El Salvador was a thriving exporter of indigo, but after the invention of synthetic dyes in the 19th century, the newly created modern state turned to coffee as the main export. The government has sought to improve the collection of its current revenues, with a focus on indirect taxes. A 10% value-added tax (IVA in Spanish), implemented in September 1992, was raised to 13% in July 1995. Inflation has been steady and among the lowest in the region. Since 1997, inflation has averaged 3%, with recent years increasing to nearly 5%. As a result of the free trade agreements, from 2000 to 2006, total exports have grown 19% from $2.94 billion to $3.51 billion, and total imports have risen 54% from $4.95 billion to $7.63 billion. This has resulted in a 102% increase in the trade deficit, from $2.01 billion to $4.12 billion. El Salvador has promoted an open trade and investment environment, and has embarked on a wave of privatization extending to telecommunications, electricity distribution, banking, and pension funds. In late 2006, the government and the Millennium Challenge Corporation signed a 5-year, $461 million compact to stimulate economic growth and reduce poverty in the country's northern region, the primary conflict zone during the Civil War, through investments in education, public services, enterprise development, and transportation infrastructure. With the adoption of the US dollar as its currency in 2001, El Salvador lost control over monetary policy. Any counter-cyclical policy response to the downturn must be through fiscal policy, which is constrained by legislative requirements for a 2/3 majority to approve any international financing.
Remittances from abroad.
El Salvador leads the region in remittances per capita, with inflows equivalent to nearly all export income. About 1/3 of all households receive these financial inflows. Remittances from Salvadorans living and working in the United States, sent to family members in El Salvador, are a major source of foreign income and offset the substantial trade deficit of $4.12 billion. Remittances have increased steadily in the last decade, and reached an all-time high of $3.32 billion in 2006, an increase of 17% over the previous year. Approximately 16.2% of gross domestic product. Remittances have had positive and negative effects on El Salvador. In 2005, the number of people living in extreme poverty in El Salvador was 20%, according to a United Nations Development Program report. Without remittances, the number of Salvadorans living in extreme poverty would rise to 37%. While Salvadoran education levels have gone up, wage expectations have risen faster than either skills or productivity. For example, some Salvadorans are no longer willing to take jobs that pay them less than what they receive monthly from family members abroad. This has led to an influx of Hondurans and Nicaraguans who are willing to work for the prevailing wage. Also, the local propensity for consumption over investment has increased. Money from remittances has also increased prices for certain commodities such as real estate. With much higher wages, many Salvadorans abroad can afford higher prices for houses in El Salvador than local Salvadorans, and thus push up the prices that all Salvadorans must pay.
Free trade agreements.
In 2006, El Salvador was the first country to ratify the Central America Dominican Republic Free Trade Agreement. CAFTA has bolstered exports of processed foods, sugar, and ethanol, and supported investment in the apparel sector, which faced Asian competition with the expiration of the multi-fiber agreement in 2005. In anticipation of the declines in the apparel sector's competitiveness, the previous administration sought to diversify the economy by promoting the country as a regional distribution and logistics hub, and by promoting tourism investment through tax incentives. There are a total of 15 free trade zones in El Salvador. El Salvador signed the Central American Free Trade Agreement (CAFTA), negotiated by the 5 countries of Central America and the Dominican Republic, with the United States in 2004. CAFTA requires that the Salvadoran government adopt policies that foster free trade. El Salvador has signed free trade agreements with Mexico, Chile, the Dominican Republic, and Panama and increased its trade with those countries. El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua also are negotiating a free trade agreement with Canada. In October 2007, these 4 countries and Costa Rica began free trade agreement negotiations with the European Union. Negotiations started in 2006 for a free trade agreement with Colombia.
Official corruption and foreign investment.
In an analysis of Arena's electoral defeat in 2009, the U.S. Embassy in San Salvador pointed to official corruption under the Sarko administration as a significant reason for public rejection of continued Arena government. According to a secret diplomatic cable made public by WikiLeaks, while the Salvadoran public may be inured to self-serving behavior by politicians, many in Arena believe that the brazen manner in which Sarko and his people are widely perceived to have used their positions for personal enrichment went beyond the pale. Arena deputy Roberto D'Orbison, son of Arena founder Roberto D'Orbison, told a U.S. diplomat that Sarko deliberately ignored his public works minister's government contract kickbacks scheme, even after the case was revealed in the press. Furthermore, considerable evidence exists, including from U.S. business sources, that the Sarko administration pushed laws and selectively enforced regulations with the specific intent to benefit Sarko family business interests. Subsequent policies under Funes administrations improved El Salvador to foreign investment, and the World Bank in 2014 rated El Salvador 109. A little better than Belize 118 and Nicaragua 119 in the World Bank's annual Ease of Doing Business Index. As per Santander Trade, a Spanish think tank in foreign investment into El Salvador has been steadily growing during the last few years. In 2013, the influx of FDI increased. Nevertheless, El Salvador receives less FDI than other countries of Central America. The government has made little progress in terms of improving the business climate. In addition to this, the limited size of its domestic market, weak infrastructures and institutions, as well as the high level of criminality have been real obstacles to investors. However, El Salvador is the second most business-friendly country in South America in terms of business taxation. It also has a young and skilled labor force and a strategic geographical position. The country's membership in the CAFTA, as well as its reinforced integration to the C4 countries' producers of cotton, should lead to an increase of FDI. Foreign companies have lately resorted to arbitration in international trade tribunals in total disagreement with Salvadoran government policies. In 2008, El Salvador sought international arbitration against Italy's Enel Green Power, on behalf of Salvadoran state-owned electric companies for a geothermal project Enel had invested in. 4 years later, Enel indicated it would seek arbitration against El Salvador, blaming the government for technical problems that prevent it from completing its investment. The government came to its defense claiming that Art 109 of the Constitution does not allow any government, regardless of the party they belong, to privatize the resources of the national soil, in this case geothermal energy. The dispute came to an end in December 2014 when both parties came to a settlement, from which no details have been released. The small country had yielded to pressure from the Washington-based powerful ICSID. The U.S. Embassy warned in 2009 that the Salvadoran government's populist policies of mandating artificially low electricity prices were damaging private sector profitability, including the interests of American investors in the energy sector. The U.S. Embassy noted the corruption of El Salvador's judicial system and quietly urged American businesses to include arbitration clauses, preferably with a foreign venue, when doing business in the country. The U.S. Embassy warned in 2009 that the Salvadoran government's populist policies of mandating artificially low electricity prices were damaging private sector profitability, including the interests of American investors in the energy sector. Not everything is bad news. In terms of how people perceived the levels of public corruption in 2014, El Salvador ranks 80 out of 175 countries as per the Corruption Perception Index. El Salvador's rating compares relatively well with Panama 94 of 175 and Costa Rica 47 of 175.
Tourism.
It was estimated that 1,394,000 international tourists would visit El Salvador in 2014. Tourism contributed $855 million to El Salvador's GDP in 2013. This represented 3.5% of total GDP. Tourism directly supported 80,500 jobs in 2013. This represented 3.1% of total employment in El Salvador. Most North American and European tourists seek out El Salvador's beaches and nightlife. Besides these two attractions, El Salvador's tourism landscape is slightly different from those of other Central American countries. Because of its geographic size and urbanization, there are not many nature-themed tourist destinations such as ecotourism or archaeological sites open to the public. Surfing is a natural tourism sector that has gained popularity in recent years as Salvadoran beaches have become increasingly popular. Surfers visit many beaches on the coast of La Libertad and the east end of El Salvador, finding surfing spots that are not yet overcrowded. The use of the United States dollar as Salvadoran currency and direct flights of 4 to 6 hours from most cities in the United States are factors that attract American tourists. Urbanization and Americanization of Salvadoran culture has also led to the abundance of American-style malls, stores, and restaurants in the three main urban areas, especially Greater San Salvador. According to the El Salvadoran newspaper El Diario de Hoy, the top 10 attractions are the coastal beaches, La Libertad, Ruta Las Flores, Suchitoto, Playa Las Flores in San Miguel, La Palma, Santa Ana, location of the country's highest volcano, Izalco, Apanica, Juayua, and San Ignacio.
Infrastructure, water supply and sanitation.
The level of access to water supply and sanitation has been increased significantly. A 2015 conducted study by the University of North Carolina called El Salvador the country that has achieved the greatest progress in the world in terms of increased access to water supply and sanitation and the reduction of inequity in access between urban and rural areas. However, water resources are seriously polluted and a large part of the wastewater discharged into the environment without any treatment. Institutionally, a single public institution is both de facto in charge of setting sector policy and of being the main service provider. Attempts at reforming and modernizing the sector through new laws have not borne fruit over the past 20 years.
Demographics.
El Salvador's population was compared to 2,200,000 in 1950. In 2010, the percentage of the population below the age of 15 was 32.1%, 61% were between 15 and 65 years of age, while 6.9% were 65 years or older. The capital city of San Salvador has a population of about 2.1 million people. An estimated 42% of El Salvador's population live in rural areas. Urbanization has expanded at a phenomenal rate in El Salvador since the 1960s. With millions moving to the cities and creating associated problems for urban planning and services. There are up to 100,000 Nicaraguans living in El Salvador.
Ethnic groups.
El Salvador's population is composed of mestizos, whites, and indigenous peoples. 86% of Salvadorans are of mestizo ancestry, having mixed indigenous and European ancestry. In the mestizo population, Salvadorans who are racially European, especially Mediterranean, as well as Afro-Salvadoran, and the indigenous people in El Salvador who do not speak indigenous languages or have an indigenous culture, all identify themselves as being culturally mestizo. 12. 7% of Salvadorans are white. A majority of Central European immigrants in El Salvador arrived during World War II as refugees from the Czech Republic, Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Switzerland. There are also small communities of Jews, Palestinian Christians, and Arab Muslims, in particular Palestinians. 0. 23% of the population are of full indigenous origin. The ethnic groups are Caquira, which represents 0.7% of the total country's population, then Pipil 0.6%, Lenca 0.4% and others minors groups 0.6%. Very few Amerindians have retained their customs and traditions, having over time assimilated into the dominant mestizo, Spanish culture. There is a small Afro-Salvadoran that is 0.13% of the total population, with blacks having traditionally been prevented from immigrating via government policies. Among the immigrant groups in El Salvador, Palestinian Christians stand out. Though few in number, their descendants have attained great economic and political power in the country, as evidenced by the election of ex-President Antonio Saca, whose opponent in the 2004 election, Shafiq Handel, was also of Palestinian descent, and the flourishing commercial, industrial, and construction firms owned by this ethnic group. There were approximately 3.2 million Salvadorans living outside El Salvador, with the United States traditionally being the destination of choice for Salvadoran economic migrants. By 2012, there were about 2.0 million Salvadoran immigrants and Americans of Salvadoran descent in the U.S., making them the sixth largest immigrant group in the country. The second destination of Salvadorans living outside is Guatemala, with more than 111,000 persons, mainly in Guatemala City. Salvadorans also live in other nearby countries such as Belize, Honduras and Nicaragua. Other countries with notable Salvadoran communities include Canada, Mexico, the United Kingdom including the Cayman Islands, Sweden, Brazil, Italy, Colombia, and Australia.
Languages.
Spanish is the official language and is spoken by virtually all inhabitants. Some indigenous people speak their native tongues such as Nahuatl and Maya, but indigenous Salvadorans who do not identify as mestizo constitute only 1% of the country's population. However, all of them can speak Spanish. Quechua is spoken by immigrants of Guatemalan and Belizean indigenous people living in El Salvador. There have also been recent large migrations of Hondurans and Nicaraguans into the country. The local Spanish vernacular is called Kalish. Salvadorans use vocio, which is also used in Argentina, Costa Rica, Nicaragua and Uruguay. This refers to the use of vo as the second-person pronoun, instead of tu. Kalish is considered informal, and a few people choose not to use it. Nahuatl is an indigenous language that has survived, though it is only used by small communities of some elderly Salvadorans in western El Salvador.
Largest cities. Religion.
The majority of the population in El Salvador is Christian. Roman Catholics 47% and Protestants 33% are the two major religious groups in the country, with the Catholic Church the largest denomination. Those not affiliated with any